How many of you have heard my presentation before? Show of hands. All right. I give the same one every time, so you guys are going to be a little bored, but that's okay. I'm going to try to take questions as we go. This is a large permit, as many of you know. It's been out since April, but the first draft of it came back in 2010 with another draft in 2013, filed in 2016. Includes lots of pages, includes about a 600-page response to comments document. I'm sure you've all read that as well, as everybody reads the response to comments document. But this is really I'm psyched. We're 3 months away from actually this 10-year process of trying to issue this permit and make some progress in Mass. So all of you are going to be implementing this thing that you helped craft, and I think we're going to make some really awesome progress in Massachusetts. So we're only 3 months away, pending, but we're only 3 months away, and I think I'm just excited to be here, and I just want to make this as informative for you as possible. So if I'm going through, if there's parts of my presentation, if there's minimum control measures, if there's things that I say that you want to dig into a little bit more, please raise your hand at that time, and let's dig into it, because it's a complicated permit. There's complicated things within it. There is nuance within language, and if there's anybody that can kind of walk you through the nuance, it'll probably be me, because I've read it multiple times and helped write it. So let's actually figure out what's in this permit, what you have to do, and if something's confusing and you want clarification, let's dig into that particular piece, because I think that'll be the most informative for everybody here. I've got an hour here. Some of my presentations, this particular presentation, can run up to 3 hours. So I'm not going to be able to dig into everything. And that's, again, saying, let's try to hit the pieces that you really want to hit. So if there's a minimum control measure you want to stop at, raise your hand and let's stop and let's dig into that minimum control measure. And there's going to be other ones that maybe we can kind of skip through pretty quickly, because they're a little easier and we don't want to get bogged down in that. So just a little background why we're here. In 1987, there was an amendment to the Clean Water Act was amended to include stormwater as a point source of pollution. That amendment really brought in large sources of pollution at that point, big cities, Boston, Worcester, Stamford, and New England, and industrial stormwater and construction stormwater. The Phase 2 regulations is why we're here today. That came in 1999, which brought in smaller sources of stormwater. So that's our smaller cities and towns. That's that red blob on the screen. That's urbanized area, as according to the U.S. Census, saying any stormwater derived from that urbanized area discharged to a water body now needed a permit to do so. So the Phase 2 program was born. Small MS4 general permits were written across the country. And right now in Massachusetts, we cover 260 municipalities. I like this one because it really shows why we're here. That blue is the urbanized area, and the red is our impaired waters in Massachusetts. So they do correspond. Wherever you have large urbanized area, you usually have more impervious cover. The more impervious cover you have, the more pollution we're getting into our waterways without treatment, just the way we've set up our stormwater systems in the past. And the more pollution in the waterways leads to more impairments. And in Massachusetts, over half of all the impairments are due to stormwater. Right now, it's our biggest issue that we're dealing with to clean up our waterways and make progress. We've basically stalled in getting to that goal of fishable, swimmable across the Commonwealth. And we've stalled due to stormwater. So that's what this permit's all about. It's about trying to get off of that plateau, get off of that stall, and move forward towards that fishable, swimmable goal. So anatomy of a general permit. The Phase 2 regs have certain things that need to be in them. So we have our 6 minimum control measures, which we'll go through today. The permit contains very prescriptive things in each one of these minimum control measures. And also water quality-based requirements. So there's a general water quality piece within the Phase 2 regulations and to meet water quality standards. And so we wrote this permit to say this is what you have to do, or this is what EPA believes we need to do to meet water quality standards. So the permit is more prescriptive than the last permit to tell the permit holders exactly what they have to do to comply with water quality standards and to comply with the Clean Water Act. And so we'll go through some of that today as well. All right. MCM1, Minimum Control Measure 1. This is our public education and outreach requirements. So from the draft in 2013 to the final, nothing really changed here. We got some comments, but basically they were clarifying comments to try to figure out what needed to be in the final permit. One big change was, what if we didn't have a particular audience in our town? Can we not target that audience? And the answer is absolutely. You don't have to target that audience. If you don't have industry in your town, you don't have to, have a targeted industry audience. We still have 4 audiences in the permit if you have those audiences in town. You need to target these audiences with a educational message 2 times for each audience over the course of the permit term. That's a total of 8 educational messages. The educational messages in particular are up to you, up to the permit holders, what you want to target. If you have a specific thing that you want to target in town, let's say you want to really focus on starting a utility, so you want to focus on what stormwater is in town and what a utility would mean for your residents. That is an educational message around stormwater. It also has another benefit for you, but it still can be used for compliance with this permit. But really, there's also a measurement application for this, so you have to measure your how well you think you're doing in your educational program, which is what I think I get the most questions on. So how am I supposed to be doing this measurement? Am I supposed to just measure the amount of brochures that go out? And yes, that is a measurement. That is one type of measurement. But the other one is we want to try to tie this more to the actual goal of your educational program. For instance, if you have a waterway that is seeing a lot of trash, for instance, you've got a lot of trash in your water in one of the lakes and ponds in town, and you really want to target the removal of that trash, get that trash out of the water. Well, what are you going to do? So you decide to do an educational message surrounding that and put in some more trash cans. You go one year, you're cleaning out a lot of trash from that pond. You do this educational message, you put in more trash cans. You go back the next year, you have noticeably less trash in that waterway. That's your measurement. Did your educational program work? Yeah, it did. We have a lot less trash that we had to remove this year than last year. That's the type of measurement we're looking for. You can say what you did, how many signs you hung up, but also what an educational benefit, what an environmental benefit was coming out of that education program. So it's supposed to be just a little more targeted towards the environmental side, but also can be a counting thing as well. So we got 8 messages over the course of 5 years, 2 per audience for each audience up there. We're going to be talking about tools later in the program today, and we have Mass DEP in particular is coming up with a lot of tools to help with crafting those messages and picking the right educational message for your particular audience. Minimum control measure number 2, public involvement and participation. This is basically verbatim right out of the Phase 2 regulations. It looks exactly like 2003 permit, except this time we've added a requirement that if you do have a website, you need to post a stormwater management plan on the website for the public to be able to view it. That's the only difference between 2003 and now. I'm going to skip right over that one. MCM3 is big. This is our biggest change. It's our biggest change from 2003 minimum control measures to 2016 minimum control measures is IDDE. And this is really because it's important. It's important across the state. We're dealing with a lot of old infrastructure, both on the sewer side, if you have sewers, and on the stormwater side. And it's a huge problem, basically. If wherever we've had any enforcement actions, whether it's in an urban area or a rural area, if you look for these illicit connections to stormwater systems, you do find them. They're just there, and it's a matter of going and looking and investigating your system. This minimum control measure is also really about knowing your assets. It's about knowing where your pipes are, knowing where your outfalls are, knowing where your manholes are, knowing where your catch basins are, and knowing, trying to come up with an asset management program to fix stuff before it fails. So these are things that you own. These are things that need to be maintained over time. If they don't, they can cause flooding issues as well as environmental issues. So this is while it is prescriptive, we feel that knowing your assets and getting rid of sewage in stormwater is a huge thing, and that's why the bulk of the changes in the permit came in this particular section. We've also had like multiple enforcement actions across Massachusetts based on illicit connections, and removed millions of gallons of sewage, particularly from the Mystic River watershed and the Charles River watershed. And it's a huge environmental benefit that came out of those programs, and we'll be able to make massive gains in water quality across the state by implementing a similar but somewhat scaled down program from what Boston was doing. We got a lot of comments on this section from draft to final, and that was basically implementation. We had a lot of deadlines and milestones within this that made costs rise based on if you found problems, how quickly you had to fix things, and how quickly you had to go out and sample outfalls, how quickly you had to go pop manholes and look for illicits, how quickly you had to come up with even their plan to do so. So we took all of those comments and tried to manipulate the program and actually rewrote a lot of this section to try to remove some of that, to alleviate some of the stress caused by some of the milestones and requirements in this section. One, to bring down costs while maintaining the environmental benefit we're going to get out of this program. So what we did was really extend timeframes. So instead of having a milestone at 5 years to come up with, to do 40% of your system, we actually said, okay, we don't actually care. We want you to do this whole thing within 10 years. Whole system, go in, you're going to be looking at your outfalls, you're going to be inspecting your outfalls, collecting a sample if you get dry weather flow, prioritizing catchment investigations, which is popping manholes at junction manholes to look for dry weather flow, to look for those illicit connections, at the same time mapping your system. So we tried to add efficiency in here and leave it more open-ended over the course of 10 years. So we're giving you 10 years to do the full mapping now instead of 3. We're giving you 10 years to do the whole program instead of making you have check-ins at year 3, 5, 8, and 10 to come up with actual milestones, to come up with like percentage of your system done. We're allowing just you guys to figure it out. The biggest comment we got was this: we know our systems, my system's really big. I've got 600 outfalls. This is going to be really hard for me to hit that 40% mark where my neighbor's got 20 outfalls and he can hit that 40% mark without doing anything, basically. And that's true. And so we needed to kind of make it a level playing field for everybody, but knowing that we needed to do this program. This program is going to remove sewage from water, and that's pretty gross, and we need to really focus on that. But you'll see, like, these 10-year milestones are there. The 10 years to complete the program was in the draft, but a lot of the things have been removed, and we got a lot of great comments about how efficiency could be bolstered in this, especially around mapping and around catchment investigations to be done at the same time instead of separately. And so we're hoping that in particular can drive down costs for folks over time. I'm going to move on from that. I know that was a very broad brush overview of what's in there. There are sampling requirements in there for wet and dry weather. The wet weather requirements have been significantly reduced as well to allow the permit holders themselves to come up with more of the vulnerability factors when they think that they have a potential for a wet weather discharge in an area. We've removed a lot of the requirements that a lot of outfalls be sampled. In particular, removed the requirement that anything older than 40 years had to be sampled in wet weather. That's been removed completely just to alleviate some of the wet weather sampling. It turned out that nobody wanted to stand in the rain, basically. That's really the takeaway from the comments. Like, people are like, I don't want to be out in the rain taking the sample. So it is important, and it's important in very particular places where you have that vulnerability for a wet weather discharge. But not every catchment is going to have those vulnerabilities for a wet weather discharge of an illicit flow. So we tried to really focus our system vulnerability factors on things like sewer crossings and combined manholes, twin inverts, things like that, where you had the potential for an overflow and a bypass. There's a lot of systems out there that are so old that they have bypasses that are engineered from the sewer system into the stormwater system that just exists, but people don't know that exists until they popped a manhole and found it. So these are things that we just want to be able to find going forward so that doesn't happen anymore. All right, moving on to construction site stormwater control. The requirements in this really come from the regulations themselves, mostly. The biggest difference is we're requiring some site plan review for construction sites that disturb over an acre of land within the municipality that discharge to the MS4. So these are just those particular and specific construction sites that discharge into the MS4. It's up to the permit holders themselves if they want to also include in this those construction sites that discharge directly to a water body. It's not required under this permit. I think most towns have the ordinance to cover both, because if you don't, you could be potentially causing water quality violations that then you have to deal with later because you have now a sediment impaired stream and I'm going to make you do more stuff the next permit term. This minimum control measure requires an ordinance to make sure you have the correct bylaws in place to enforce against any construction site that does not put in stormwater controls that then discharges into the MS4. And site inspection procedures, this is not site inspection procedures for the construction site to do on itself. It is a one-time inspection by the municipality of the construction site to make sure that what they said they were going to do in their site plan as far as stormwater controls that they're actually doing. And the goal of this is really to reduce the amount of sediment getting into the MS4 system before it's discharged. And that's in recognition that you own your system. So what you take into your system, you also then own. So the idea really of this permit as a whole, in particular this minimum control measure, is to stop the pollution from getting into the system first. So stopping it at the source before it becomes yours. The way the Clean Water Act is written, you have that point source discharging into a water body. You own that. And so when there's a violation at that source, you also own that violation. Doesn't matter where it's coming from, that's yours. So the idea is to have a very strong program in place to prevent things from getting into the system before you own it. And that's really what this minimum control measure is about. Not too much change from draft to final here. We still have pretty much, we didn't get that many comments in this section, honestly. A lot of comments were like, this overlaps with the construction general permit, which is true. Those sites that discharge to the MS4 have to get a construction general permit as well from EPA. But the construction general permit is about site inspections by the construction company itself on its own construction site. And this minimum control measure is an inspection procedure by the permit holder on the person using their system. And that's what this minimum control measure is really about. So pretty much everything stayed. Post-construction stormwater management. This is the second place where we got a lot of comments. So this changed quite a bit from draft to final, and it changed a whole lot from 2010 to 2013 draft. And this one is to try to basically catch Massachusetts up and New Hampshire. New Hampshire's got the same basic requirements with the rest of the country and the rest of New England. So post-construction stormwater management, like when you're doing a redevelopment or development project that disturbs more than an acre of land, that discharges to the MS4, the permit holder needs to have, the municipality needs to have in place an ordinance or bylaw that requires long-term post-construction stormwater control on that site. And this is because it's the cheapest way to control stormwater moving forward. So if we're going to make progress in how we deal with stormwater, moving away from the traditional way of getting it to the waterway as fast as possible, and moving towards a more integrated, more holistic approach of having these infiltration practices and green infrastructure practices that filter the water, get water back into the ground where it's not going to cause as much degradation of our streams, not going to cause as much erosion of our streams, not going to put as much pollution into our streams and waterways. That's how we're going to make progress moving forward. It's going to be the cheapest way to do it. It's when you already are doing that construction project, when you're already digging up that land, you're doing that redevelopment project, the cheapest way to put in a new stormwater control is then. It's not digging up something in a retrofit scenario. So this minimum control measure is really getting at when we're doing something, when we're digging up the land, we got to think about how stormwater is going to be managed on that site. Let's think about how it's going to impact water quality as well. We're not talking about just detention anymore. We're talking about actually actively managing stormwater in a way that's a little different than we have in the past. And that's going to be through infiltration requirements or pollutant removal requirements that are contained in this minimum control measure. So new development has to retain, the ordinance or bylaws need to require that the post-construction standards need to require that an inch of runoff from impervious area on that developed site needs to be retained. So take all of the impervious area on that site that will be discharging to the MS4, take an inch over that area, and that's what needs to be retained on site over time. We're not talking about every single storm here. We're not talking about every single time there's an inch of rain needs to be retained. We're talking about designing a BMP with the storage capacity or infiltration capacity to infiltrate the 1 inch storm. So we're not going to catch everything. There's going to be certain storms that we're going to have, those BMPs will be mostly full and we're going to get a lot of bypass, but that's okay too. We're still going to catch about 90% of everything based on our rainfall patterns in Massachusetts. And that's the standard we're trying to hit, is retaining about 90% of the storms. And that's it. That standard in particular is the 90 percentile storm is pretty ubiquitous across the country. So it changes, obviously the amount of rainfall changes across the country, but that 90 percentile for post-construction is really a ubiquitous standard, especially in New England. Every other state has that 90% standard in some way. Either it's the 1 inch rainfall capture or it's a 90 percentile storm, and then in New England they're the same thing. This minimum control measure is also targeted at pollutants because that's what this permit is targeted at. So it's not a retention requirement. You're not required to infiltrate as part of this minimum control measure, because what we're talking about with this permit is pollution removal. So there's an option in this permit, and your ordinance or bylaw needs to include this option, that the stormwater management system can be designed in such a way that 90% of the average TSS load and 60% of the average phosphorus load are removed on an annual basis. So we're targeting these two particular pollutants in particular because we know the most about BMPs for the removal efficiencies for these two particular pollutants. We know we're going to also get nitrogen removal here. We're going to get bacteria removal. We're going to get solids removal, which means we're going to get metals removal if we're just targeting these two particular pollutants. We know we're going to come out with some tools that will help developers figure out like which size BMPs, what type of BMPs will get them to that 90 percentile and the 60 percentile or 90% removal of annual load of phosphorus or sediment and 60% of phosphorus. So it's all based on BMP sizing and BMP performance over time. So we did a lot of modeling and a lot of contracting with consultants to come up with UNH Stormwater Center in particular to come up with BMP efficiencies that we were pretty solid with, and we could come out with tools that we believe that once these BMPs are installed, this is how they're going to perform without forcing any monitoring on anybody, because monitoring BMPs is not an easy task. Redevelopment, we got a lot of comments on redevelopment from draft to final. And so we don't want to disincentivize redevelopment. And in the draft, we had pretty much the same standards from new development to redevelopment. And we got a lot of comments saying, well, that's going to disincentivize redevelopment. We don't want to do that. We don't want to push development out. We want to be able to redevelop and get more benefits than in lands that are already there instead of having to try to retrofit them. We want to make sure that we can redevelop them and get our stormwater controls in place. So we totally agree with that, and we did not ever want to disincentivize redevelopment. So we looked at how we could kind of come down with our standards for the redevelopment, and looked across the country and what other places were doing. Instead of looking at the 90 percentile storm, people were doing the 85th percentile storm for redevelopment, just to lower the standard a little bit. So we took the same approach, and instead of requiring the first inch of runoff from impervious area to be either infiltrated or treated on site, we went down to 0.8 inches, which actually equals the 85th percentile storm for all of New England. We also lowered the treatment requirement to 80% of the average TSS load and 50% of the phosphorus load if you're just going to do treatment on site. And you can actually hit these two metrics pretty easily with a lot of different BMPs that are out there. And you can hit them at a pretty small volume. So one of the great things that I think has come out of the UNH Stormwater Center in the last 5 years is the focus on looking at how small, undersized BMPs actually work and how much annual load of sediments and phosphorus and nitrogen they actually can remove. And they can remove a lot. So you can put in a smaller system that's only designed, that's like typically would be undersized. You think of like a water quality volume as the 1 inch rainfall that you're going to design that BMP for, but let's say you only design it for the ½ inch rainfall. You're almost going to get that 50% phosphorus removal and 80% TSS removal for a number of BMPs at that sizing. So that's a small BMP that's performing very well. And that phenomena is just, especially in this region, is because of our rainfall patterns. We have a lot of small storms. So if you can catch that first flush every time, you're going to remove most of the sediment and phosphorus and nitrogen and metals, load, bacteria, just from a smaller size BMP, even if there's a lot of bypass. We've also put in some off-site mitigation in here, and I think this is one thing that we don't. I like it. People asked for it in comments, saying we'd like to have more off-site mitigation options when the redevelopment site is really tight and there's no way to do anything on that site with infiltration or putting in a treatment BMP, or they can only put in a really tiny one and can't get to these removal efficiencies. The idea is being able to allow that redevelopment to go forward, but getting the pollution removal that the stream needs at a different site. And so off-site mitigation is one way to do that. And we don't particularly know exactly how that's going to play out. It may play out differently in every town, but there's going to be a need to look at where in town you can get things, where in town you want projects to be done, where in town that other projects have gone above and beyond the standards and you can take credit for some of that and allow development in another area. And I don't think we'll really know how this is going to play out till some towns start to do it and start to implement it. And we want to help along the way for all of this and be involved. But I think this offsite mitigation thing is going to be somewhat challenging, but very beneficial for every permit holder. Yeah. Yeah.
Does the permit require that their ordinance allow the offsite mitigation and outline that, or is it what's the permit require with the offsite mitigation?
Okay, so the question is, what does the permit require with offsite mitigation? And actually, the permit does not require that you have an offsite mitigation program. So it's an allowable thing under the permit. It's an option for municipalities to put that ordinance or bylaw with the offsite mitigation in it, but it's not a requirement. We also updated the linear project exemption. We got a lot of comments on that saying if I'm redoing a road, what does it actually mean? And so we're allowing we went to the Massachusetts Stormwater standards for that and said if you're doing a project that is increasing the impervious area by less than one roadway width, you can, on a linear project only, you can continue to do that. But if you're doing anything more than that, it's going to be considered a redevelopment project. There's some more post-construction here. We've got some reports looking at zoning bylaws and ordinances within town that actually disincentivize green infrastructure or impediments to green infrastructure, and putting in a schedule to remove those impediments. So we're not telling you what that needs to be. We're not saying what you have to prioritize. We're not saying every impediment that we're going to be able to come in there and say, you know, this is an impediment and you should have removed it. We're not going to be doing that. This is for the municipality, for the permit holder, to say, okay, if I have these post-construction standards, how can I allow construction in my town as easy as possible to meet those standards? And do I have anything in my bylaws, my zoning ordinances, that's going to cause an impediment to that? And how can I remove it? That's the goal of that particular report. And that's the goal of that thing. We're requiring an inventory and retrofit an inventory of retrofit sites. This is not saying you have to retrofit these sites. It's saying you have to actually just find them. So do an inventory of town. Are there certain places where you'd like to see a green street that you think would be good? Do you have a certain area that has an old detention basin that could be turned in to be retrofitted into a gravel wetland? Do you have, where in town do you own that you could actually do retrofits that would be environmentally beneficial? We've removed it from looking at all sites in town to just coming up with a list of 5 and keeping it at that list of 5 over time. And the idea here is that offsite mitigation that we talked about. So when you have a developer coming in that wants to redevelop a site and the site's too tight, or you want to get, maybe you just want to have them get the environmental benefits somewhere else, you can have sites ready to go. Say, like, I have these 5 projects that I know I want to do. This is where they are. It doesn't say you have to have like a 10% design plan done. It just says you have to have them ready to go. Some places will have that 10% design plan done and say, listen, I've got this project, you pay for it, you can go through with your redevelopment over here. And that's the idea for that particular requirement. There's no longer a requirement to track impervious cover over time in the final permit. That was one of the big removal. Everybody loved that requirement from the draft permit. Really a lot of love for that. So we've removed it completely. It's just got struck. There's no requirement anymore. I think from 2010, when we first envisioned it, through 2013, there's been a lot of advances in just the way that impervious cover is mapped, and a lot of it is mapped remotely. Remote sensing has come a long way even within the last 7 years. And I think as an agency, we believe that that's a much better way to go than trying to have each municipality come up with some sort of inventory of it and try to track it like in a spreadsheet form over time that then they're going to have to reconcile later with when a remote sensing project takes place. And then how do you do that reconciliation? And there's just you're duplicating effort at that point, and it's way too much effort to track than to do some remote sensing at a certain interval. So God willing, we'll have some money to throw at that at some point, but I can't promise anything. Good housekeeping requirements. This is where the bulk of the money is spent for permit compliance. This is the big ticket item. These are your operation maintenance procedures on municipal owned properties, the catch basin cleaning requirements, street sweeping requirements, and stormwater pollution prevention plan requirements on waste handling facilities, so like transfer stations. So all parks, municipal buildings, and vehicle washing stations or equipment maintenance stations need O&M procedures. So that's just what you're doing for stormwater management on those sites. It's basically like basically a mini stormwater pollution prevention plan that you have for each one of your sites. Includes some training that's required for the people that do the maintenance on that to make sure that we're storing things properly on site. You're doing that maintenance in an area where you're not exposing pollutants to stormwater that can be washed off readily into streams. Catch basin cleaning. We got a lot of comments on the catch basin cleaning, but I didn't know what to do with them because in 2010 the comments were, this is before my time, but the comments were, you're making us clean every catch basin once a year. Don't tell me to clean my catch basins once a year. I know when to clean my catch basins. It's like, sure, we absolutely agree with that. I don't want to tell you when to clean your catch basins. What I want you to do is have them actually function. So we changed it up in 2013 to say, yeah, you're right. I'm not going to tell you when to clean your catch basins. You come up with a schedule. Catch basins only work if they're less than 50% full, so come up with a plan to make them 50% full. And we got comments saying, well, don't tell me to do that, just tell me when to clean my catch basin so I know how to comply with the permit. So I was like, I don't know what to do, so I left it. It's still at 50, come up with a plan to make them 50% full. What we did in the final permit was make it very clear that the permit requirement itself was not that each catch basin was 50% full, so someone can come out there with a measuring tape and say this one's 60% full, you're in violation of your permit. That's not what the permit says, especially in the final. We made it very clear that the actual permit requirement for catch basin cleaning is to come up with a plan to clean the catch basins so that they remain less than 50% full. And when you go out there and clean a catch basin that's more than 50% full, reprioritize that catch basin for more frequent cleaning. That's the goal of that program. That's what the permit requires. So you're not, if you go out and find one that's 80% full and you reprioritize it for cleaning at instead of every year, you're going to do it at every 8 months to see if that works. That's compliance with this piece of the permit. Even though that catch basin was 80% full at that time, you've reprioritized it, so you're in compliance with the permit requirements. Street sweeping is one time per year. Don't feel like that's really a big lift. Most places do that already. The biggest change from draft to final here was we got a lot of comments on uncurbed roadways that just have country drainage. They don't have catch basins. They don't have curbs. And why would we be sweeping there? So we said, you don't have to sweep there. Come up with a plan. If you want to sweep there, you don't have to. So come up with a plan of how you're going to address those roadways. Do you want to sweep there every 2 years? Do you just never want to sweep there? That's an okay plan. Just have something how you're going to be dealing with those uncurbed roadways. But you do not have to sweep them once per year. What else we got? We pushed out the O&M procedure requirements and the stormwater pollution prevention plan creation requirements. They're both at 2 years now. So they're like instead of 1 year and 2 years, which they were before, they're both at 2 years because they're very similar things. So folks were like, we just want to create them at the same time. That seemed totally fine with us, so we pushed those both out to 2 years. So this is our cost breakdown for minimum control measures. There's one big piece of the pie up there. It's 70% of the estimated total cost. So of the program implementation is minimum control measure 6. It's our catch basin cleaning. It's our street sweeping. It's our system maintenance. It is system inspections. There are O&M procedures. It's training our staff. That's what we're talking about. That's going to drive the cost of this permit over the next 5 years. MCM3 comes in at 12%, and this was probably around 2% for 2003 because most people didn't have to do anything for illicit discharge detection and elimination. So we have a very large, 10% increase in cost for IDDE programs in particular. That's where the biggest cost increase came with this permit. It's within that IDDE section. That's going to be, for some folks, it's going to be totally fine, and it's not going to be a new cost because they have a very robust IDDE program, either because they've got enforcement actions already on them or because they've been proactive. Other towns, this is going to be a big lift because they're starting from scratch, and they don't have that program in place. So MCM3 comes in at about 12% of total program cost over the next 5 years. And the rest of it, MCM 1, 2, 4, and 5, this is going to be a lot, that's where a lot of the administrative tasks come up. That's updating ordinances where needed, making sure they're in place. That's site inspection things. That's reviewing as-built drawings for stormwater systems, making sure post-construction standards are in place, coming up with off-site mitigation program if that's what you want to do. Dealing with us and DEP giving us our annual reports that are required, coming up with those reports that are required to look at impediments to green infrastructure. All of those like administrative things come up, and they're going to total out at about 18, give or take, % of total program costs over the next 5 years. There's going to be more talk about costs coming up, but that's in general what this permit requires, and that's how your costs are going to break down. Impaired Waters requirements. So this is a separate section of the permit. It is specifically targeted at those pollutants up there for both TMDLs and for impaired waters. So this permit tailors the water quality section of the permit to those particular pollutants found in stormwater. We know that stormwater contains all of this. We've been studying stormwater pretty extensively since the 80s. This is what stormwater contains. Unless you have some sort of chemical spill, we're going to find, this is what you're going to find in stormwater at some level. Stormwater, yes, is rainwater, but it picks up pollutants over the ground, and it picks up all of these things. And you take enough samples at any stormwater outfall pipe, you're going to find concentrations of every single one of these at some level over the course of that year. So stormwater contains these things. So when we're discharging to a water body that's impaired due to one of these things, or a water body that has a TMDL that calls out stormwater as causing or contributing to an impairment for one of these things, we need to do some more work. We've got to control stormwater because stormwater is causing the impairment in that stream or river. And this permit aims to tell the holder of the permit exactly what they have to do and leave it not ambiguous. So the 2003 permit left it ambiguous. It said you can't cause or contribute to a water quality violation, and you have to meet TMDLs. And it stopped there. It stopped like that's it. Well, that leaves it so wide open for anybody's interpretation. Our interpretation, DEP's interpretation, your interpretation, a third party's interpretation of those particular lines can get people into settlements in court, and it has. And so this permit really set out to say we want to keep the NIPD's permit framework in place where your permit actually tells you what you have to do to comply with the Clean Water Act. And so we focus this section on bolstering the requirements when you're discharging to a water body that's impaired for any one of these, and really telling the permit holder what they have to do to maintain compliance with the Clean Water Act and with the permit. We have certain requirements for bacteria and pathogens, so it's when we're dealing with bacteria and pathogens, it's a hard thing to deal with, so we're dealing with really public education here. Additional public education requirements really surrounding dog waste. Dog waste is a huge problem for pathogens. We're also dealing with IDDE is one of the biggest contributors to bacteria in waterways, so prioritizing those waterways that are receiving MS4 discharges that are impaired for bacteria is going to be part of what you have to do for your additional requirements. We have nutrient impaired waters. So this is phosphorus and nitrogen. So stormwater contains phosphorus and nitrogen. We need to start to target our BMPs within our 6 minimum control measures to really focus on the removal of nitrogen and phosphorus when you're discharging to a water body that's impaired for those things. So this is an additional public education message surrounding the removal of nitrogen and phosphorus. It's going to be talking about like lawn clippings collection. You want to start a leaf litter program collection. Also, dog waste can be in here. Additional new and redevelopment requirements. This is specifically for nitrogen, because there's no nitrogen requirement in the post-construction standards. So we're looking at trying to optimize for nitrogen removal when you're discharging to a nitrogen impaired waterway. And what that optimize means is general, right? It's kind of up to how the town wants. Do they want to put in a nitrogen requirement? Like some towns in the Cape are talking about that. For new and redevelopment requirements. That's not, you don't have to though, that's an option. It just says you need to optimize for nitrogen removal for new and redevelopment. So when you get a post-construction stormwater control plan in from your developer, you want to make sure that they're looking at BMPs first that are designed to remove as much nitrogen as possible, or they're looking at the BMPs that have the best performance for nitrogen. We've also got in here a nutrient source identification report. So this is really looking for hot spots within town, where you have like either a large area of impervious cover that's probably contributing a lot of phosphorus and nitrogen to that water body. Looking to delineate different sources of those hot spots. Maybe it's a large ball field that has a lot of fertilizer applied to it. You have some areas of town that you know are just using too much fertilizer. And looking for possible retrofit opportunities. So are there any of these hotspots that can be retrofitted to remove phosphorus and nitrogen before it's discharged? So it's just putting in a gravel wetland, putting in a rain garden, doing something, putting in a Green Street project. It says you need to look at the different options within the town, on your own properties, and put in one retrofit project by year 6. So again, didn't think this was a heavy lift. We've got 4 years to do this report, to come up with different areas to do a retrofit project, another 2 years to actually do that retrofit project. There's no size requirement here. This could be a rain garden at the mayor's house. It can be anything. We just want, the focus here is on looking at the problem, trying to figure out where your problem areas are in town, and try to focus on where you can help out that issue. Additional requirements are sediment, metals, oil, and grease. All of these requirements are related to removing sediment from stormwater, because metals and oil and grease adhere to your sediment particles. So we have additional good housekeeping requirements. Nothing really changed here at all from draft to final. This was pretty much left the same. We didn't get any comments on this. No one seemed to be that particularly. There's no requirement to do even 2 street sweepings per year. The requirement is actually to come up with a targeted plan for street sweeping on those high sediment load areas in town. Chloride impaired waters. Chloride is hard. It's probably one of the hardest things we're going to be dealing with over the next 50 years for drinking water and stormwater quality. So when there's a chloride impaired water, which I think there's 3 of in the state, we don't really have that many. I'm assuming that's going to grow as we move forward. But really here we're talking about, like with the salt reduction plan, nothing really changed here from draft to final, but we're talking about coming up with best management practices for the control and like lowering the use of salt. We're not telling you have to lower it to the point where where public safety becomes an issue. We're just saying that there's multiple ways to reduce salt that people are doing across the country that towns should probably look at, such as like pre-wetting programs or calibration programs. This also ends up being a very big cost savings for towns that implement these BMPs. In New Hampshire, they have like what's called the Green Snow Pro program, where a town that implements all the BMPs that they get trained on can see up to a 20% reduction in salt use. And that's a lot. So that's not only you're reducing 20% of the salt going into streams or groundwater sources, but you're also saving a lot of money every year because you're buying 20% less salt. The final permit contains relief from impaired waters requirements. We got the biggest comments we got moving through all of these impaired waters requirements were the fact that there was no relief mechanism. So they got into the program, they got into these extra requirements because they got the 303D list came out and it was impaired for, their pond now was impaired for phosphorus, and they got thrown into all these extra requirements and reports. But there was no way for them to get out. So what happens when the water body's cleaned up? What happens when we actually do what we're setting out to do in this program, which is actually, have a fishable, swimmable water that's off that 303D list? And so we tried to craft some language in the final permit to deal with that. And we got a lot of comments on it and spent a lot of time. I spent a lot of lawyer time coming up with what the relief can look like with adhering to Clean Water Act requirements. So now there are relief requirements within the permit. So if we're receiving water, and in the case of nutrients, the downstream receiving waters are determined no longer to be impaired, you get relief from the requirements of the permit. And what that means is a new 303D list comes out, says the water is no longer impaired. EPA approves that 303D list. At the date of that approval, you're relieved from the requirements that you would have had to do moving forward. So let's take a phosphorus lake, for example. It's on the 303D list now, it doesn't have a TMDL. You have additional requirements related to it. 3 years after the permit, you do a lot of work on it. You've been doing work on it to try to fix it because it's a nuisance problem. You do a good job. It's cleaned up within 3 years. At that 3-year mark, your 4-year report isn't due yet. The 3-year mark comes, you're off the 303D list, EPA approves it, you no longer have to do that identification report or the retrofit project. If a TMDL comes out that says, actually, for this water body in particular, stormwater is not an issue, no stormwater needs to be controlled for this water body, for this pollutant of concern, we're going to get all the reductions through Jack's farm up the street. That's also fine. Like when that happens and the TMDL says no stormwater reductions are needed, you are relieved from the requirements of the permit. You can also look at your discharge and see if you're actually causing or contributing to the water quality violation in the stream. And what that means is if you're discharging bacteria, metals, sediment, chloride, oil, and grease, but to an impaired water body, but your actual discharge is meeting water quality standards, you're not actually causing or contributing to that water quality violation, so you can be relieved of the permit requirements. That's kind of a vague one right now because we need to come up with a sampling protocol. And if any of you want to go down that road, I'll be happy to work with you to figure out that, and we can come up with a fact sheet. TMDL requirements, there's also a lot of TMDLs in Massachusetts. Each of them have specific requirements related to them. I'm not going to go through each one because I don't have time, but all of these up there, bacteria, the Cape nitrogen, Assabet River, Long Island Sound, and out-of-state Rhode Island water TMDLs, all the requirements there are the same exact requirements as for impaired waters. So they are basically verbatim from Appendix H to Appendix F, they're the same. And that's because in those particular TMDLs, while they called out stormwater as a source of the pollutant that needed to be reduced, they did not provide an actual specific waste load allocation for that pollutant of concern. And when that happens, we know it needs to be reduced, but we don't, as the permit writers, also don't know how much. So when we don't know how much, we know just as much as if it was just on the 303D list. We didn't learn really much at all. So your requirements are the same, because if all we know it's impaired and needs to be reduced, just like the impaired waters list, then the requirements should be the same. There's two up there, the Charles River and the Lake and Pond Phosphorus TMDLs, that are very prescriptive, and they include timelines and implementation plans for the next 20 years for the Charles River, the next 15 years for lake and ponds. They include a lot of planning, long-term implementation schedule that kind of ramps up over time. As you can see, it kind of like it's going to require a lot of gains in pollution, phosphorus reduction through retrofits, hopefully over time, but also going to require a long-term plan. Not retrofits. A long-term plan for retrofits, but also getting pollution reduction through redevelopment. And so we're trying to give time up front for the first 10 years to get a lot of these reductions through redevelopment projects, and having a long-term plan for if we can't reach it through redevelopment, that you're going to have to get into retrofits, and then that's going to ramp up over time as we know more. We're coming up with a lot of tools to help out with this, to help out with those two TMDLs in particular. These tools will also help out with post-construction standards for reduction of different pollutants in stormwater based on different BMPs. We're not talking about going out and sampling outfalls here for either of these TMDLs. We're not talking about coming up with a sampling program for how your BMPs are producing. The idea here is to come up with a suite of BMPs that we're comfortable with their pollution removal performance for phosphorus, allow them to be implemented by the permit holders, and give the permit holder credit for a phosphorus reduction just based on the installation and maintenance of that BMP. And then it becomes an accounting system. So the accounting exercise, we came up with some spreadsheet tools to help out with that accounting exercise. Those should be available hopefully by the end of April on the website so people can start to play around with them. We're going to have rollouts specific to Charles River requirements over the next 5 years. The next 5 years for Charles River and lakes is all planning. There's not one retrofit that needs to be installed in the ground for any of these TMDLs over the next 5 years. This is all planning for this permit term. And that's because we realize that these are big lifts in a lot of cases, and planning is going to be paramount. There's no way we're going to be able to do anything and meet these TMDLs without significant planning. And that planning process is probably going to take 5 years. The final permit also contains relief from those TMDL requirements. We got some of that, but the relief is specific here that a new TMDL has to be put out that says that no stormwater controls are actually needed to meet the new TMDL targets. Timing, we talked about timing before. On July 1st it goes into effect, and the notice of intent is due September 29th, 2017, and we should be rolling out a webinar and some help with how to fill out an NOI within the month. Your first year requirements are here. I think this is a handout as well. That's it for year one. We've removed a lot of requirements for year one. We got a lot of comments saying this is too front loaded. We had too much to do in year one. We need to back off, and we pushed off a lot of requirements to year two or beyond. And year one is really, there's not much beyond what hopefully you all are doing already, and that's to allow time to ramp up for later in the permit term when things start to become real, and you start to have a lot of IDDE stuff that needs to be done.